Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're at 2 o'clock, so we should resume. As we left things, I was going to come back to Mr. May, wasn't I? Go on.
Thank you, sir. Can you just give me half a minute while I get my papers? Thank you, sir. We had got to the stage of having, I hope, a helpful discussion as to how to reflect the interaction between local transport plan, local transport strategy and local plan. And we were going to look at the comments on the individual transport policies. Just one comment, and it's really a recommendation to the Council and to you, sir. We're faced over the next 8 years with a really major change, if we believe the climate strategy, with this 25% reduction in person travel and 33% increase in active travel, to take two examples. And that cannot be delivered, all the evidence suggests it cannot be delivered by a series of mode-specific policies on their own. We need an overarching statement somewhere that shows how these 9 policies fit together and reinforce one another. And I think it would be really helpful in the final revision of section 14, if that was set out. Our preference would be to see it as a policy in its own right, but whether that's the case or not, having an acceptance that the transport policy has to be more than just the sum of the parts would be useful. But in terms of the particular policies, and I think you said you would like me to go through quickly comments on each of them in turn, so I'll go quickly through the whole. Much of this is in our written statement, but of course, in many ways, the policies have changed as a result of the revised submission. Policy T1 we are broadly supportive of, but we are concerned that we still don't have a Sustainable Transport Development, SPD, and that in its absence, there is nothing obvious to which to refer in guiding a developer on what they need to provide. And so our strong recommendation would be to include a reference in it to the 2005 Development Control document, which is still what is used in planning decisions, and also the very helpful table from the 2014 draft of the local plan, which set out, and this picks up some of the questions from earlier, the expected level of provision for a high-quality public transport service to new developments. These are documents which the Council has already produced and which could be referred to in T1 as a holding position prior to the production of the new Sustainable Transport Development SPD. So that's a specific recommendation on that. Policy T2 I wanted to spend a bit more time on because this has had some major changes, quite a bit of which are deleting detail. And I understand the reason behind keeping life simple, but we are concerned that quite a lot of the important elements in T2 have been omitted. It was clearly sound at the time the Council put together the original T2 to refer to the importance of bus priorities, urban traffic control, demand management, parking controls as ways of supporting bus services. It cannot be sound now to take those out of the latest draft. They really need, we suggest, to be reinstated. And at the same time, we've had a useful discussion this morning about the need for a high-quality bus access to ST14. The new draft has a reference to that for ST15. We suggest it would sensibly include one for ST14 as well. So that's the comments on T2, and as you'll understand, they're largely comments that add to what we submitted because T2 has changed so dramatically. Would you like me to pause at that point? So if you're... Okay, thank you. T3, which is York Station, again, we're broadly supportive of. We made some specific recommendations in our written statement about ensuring that the bus interchange is large enough to provide for all the services, the bus services which we would expect to serve the station. At the moment, it isn't, but it would be perfectly feasible to do that. And at the same time, to acknowledge that given the overall objective of improving the environment, carbon reduction and so on, the level of parking that was proposed for the station needs to be reassessed. As we understand it, Network Rail have already come to that conclusion, but it would be sensible if the council did as well. So two things there. First of all, add a reference to the importance of an effective bus interchange, and secondly, add a reference to the need to manage car use by reconsidering the parking provision. T4 is the highways policy, and we remain concerned that this policy is over-reliant on road building as a solution. We've already heard the arguments that in the absence of other action, expanding road capacity attracts more traffic. And crucially, this policy still says absolutely nothing about the most important lever the council has on highways, which is traffic management. We would like, at the very least, to see a rider in here that says that any upgrades to the outer ring road, the short-term one or the longer-term one as proposed, are accompanied with traffic management action to ensure that the traffic that currently filters through residential streets in inner York is diverted to the outer ring road. So that's our key point on T4. A, building in traffic management as part of the strategy, part of the policy, and B, linking the two together. T5, which is active travel, we very much welcome the fact that the council is now embarking on a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan. We do observe that it was asked to do so back in 2017, but at least this is now happening, which is good. But again, we have issues of development control. We would expect the LC whip, if you'll excuse the abbreviation, to include a number of proposals for new rights of way for walking and cycling. But if those aren't identified in the local plan, it becomes very difficult to protect them. So our recommendation there would be again to put in a link back to the 2005 development control specification as being the basis for protecting rights of way in advance of the local cycling and walking infrastructure plan. And that way we've got protection in the interim period. Policy T6 we broadly support. Policy T6 is about protecting public transport sites. We would like to see the word facilities added back in. We couldn't understand why public transport facilities as opposed to interchanges are no longer to be protected. And we're concerned that the revised wording removes an exception for developments that generate unsustainable levels of car use. Apparently, as a result of that deletion, we now have a situation where a development can be built close to a public transport interchange if it generates unsustainable levels of car use, which frankly doesn't, to us, make a great deal of sense. So simply reinstate that deletion. Policy T7, again, we broadly support, and I just refer to our written statement on that. Policy T8 deals with demand management, but it actually only deals with a very, very limited part of demand management. We know that we've got to achieve at least half our carbon reduction through behavioural change. And a part of that has to come from managing the demand for car use. We have listed in our written submission all the proposals that we put together in our transport strategy as elements that should be considered. They include supporting for working, studying and shopping from home, which ought to be linked to Policy C1, design of new communities so that they provide local facilities, which links to DP2 and SS1, the promotion of travel plans for individuals, for schools and for workplaces, managing the road network to give priority to access travel and public transport, using parking charges as a direct influence on car use, and considering workplace parking, levies and road pricing, as we know Oxford in one case and Cambridge in another are already doing. All of those ought to be referenced in a policy on demand management. As if they're not, then it's a very incomplete process. And the other point on policy T8 is that at the moment we have again no sustainable transport for development SPD, and therefore no defensible set of parking standards. And we would like to see the link again back to the 2005 Development Control Plan in the interim until that SPD is produced. Finally, policy T9, and this is a sort of catch-all at the end of section 14, and it covers freight and what I've called new motive power, new sources of fuel. Those are not obvious bedfellows, and we suggest that it would be sensible to separate them out into two separate policies, a T9 on freight and a T10 on new motive power. T9 on freight only mentions the idea of a consolidation centre on the periphery of York, which has been under consideration for a decade but had little progress. The council has a report, a very good report, from a couple of months ago on transshipment centres close to the city centre, the use of cargo bikes, the support for portering, the management of freight movements. And again, we think it's sensible that any revision of T9, and it hasn't been revised at all at the moment, actually reflects that wider and much more effective set of measures for freight. And then finally, on what for us would be the policy T10 on alternative fuels, the focus here at the moment, if I remind myself of my notes, is on hydrogen and other sources of fuel, whereas now we have a crucial requirement for charging facilities for electric vehicles. The Council has, we think, a broadly effective policy on provision. We're not sure that it's providing enough, given we're expecting at least half the fleet to be electric by 2030. But clearly, where you put these electric vehicle charging hubs is a planning matter, and it really does need to be reflected in the transport plan. So, not into the local plan. So my apologies to go through in some detail, but I hope those are acceptable points for improvement.
Yes, most helpful. Rather than widen the debate at this point, Mr. Lannis, I think it's probably best we deal with these.
Thank you, sir. I'll ask Mr. Ridge to pick up on any other points of detail. I think the broad point in response is that none of what we have heard goes anywhere near soundness. As Mr. May, it's not really a case of whether you can improve the plan, it's whether you need to make modifications to make it sound. We don't accept that any of his suggestions fall into that category. As far as the first suggestion of having an overarching policy is concerned, we don't accept that. The policies will be read as a whole by anyone looking at the plan when one looks at T1 to T9 together. And in any event, if one wants to look for broader principles that apply to transport development, one can look back to Chapter 2 in the Spatial Strategy, which contains policies setting out the broad approach to transport. So we don't accept that that's a change that needs to be made to the plan. Similarly, under policy T1, we don't accept that one needs to be as specific as to setting out an expected level of provision for high-quality service provision. As with other changes that have been made to the other policies as now proposed by the Council, it's important that the policies aren't too prescriptive or specific in circumstances where matters may change. In any event, T1 broadly covers the issues that would have to be addressed in an adequate way, and the considerations that would have to be taken into account in terms of frequent high-quality public transport, linking development to the city centre, and you don't need to go any further than that to ensure the soundness of the plan by identifying anything more specific by way of performance standards. Again, a number of points were made in relation to referring to existing documents by way of a holding position. This was raised by Mr. May under T1 and other policy, but I can deal with the point more generally here. Again, we don't accept that that is a matter relating to soundness. To the extent that existing documents are relevant to any development control decisions, they will be taken into account when applying the broad policy test. It's not necessary to go into further detail in the supporting text to achieve that. Turning to policy T2, Mr. May made reference to making specific references to the importance of the bus interchange and the need to manage car parking at the station. Again, we don't accept that those amendments are necessary to make the policy sound. Sorry, that's T3. I'll come back to that in a moment. T2, there was a complaint about the deletion of specific measures within policy at T2. We don't accept that criticism. The point about the changes to policy T2 was not to ossify the policy with specific reference to specific schemes. The better approach was to cross-refer to the infrastructure delivery plan, which can be looked at separately given the specific cross-reference in the policy. And so far as specific reference was made about bus service improvements, paragraph 14.17 of the supporting text as amended specifically refers to the development of York's bus network in the short term through interventions in the York Bus Service Improvement Programme, and some detail has been added there about how that's intended to operate. So we don't accept that any changes are required to T2 either. Returning to T3, with apologies, we don't accept, again, the changes that Mr May was proposing. If one looks at T3, there is already reference to developing the station so as to assist in the improvement of public transport turnaround and interchange facilities as part of a general package of measures to improve access at the station. And that's criterion 4. And criterion 5 refers to consolidating public car parks, maintaining an appropriate level of long stay and short stay parking at the station. It's not necessary for the policy to go any further than that or go into any greater specifics in the way that Mr May has mentioned. Turning to policy T4, I think the point raised there is that there should be more specific reference to the issue of diverting traffic to the outer ring road. Again, it's important not to see that policy in isolation because policy T8 deals generally with demand management, so any issues that might arise in relation to T4 in the way that would be mentioned would also need to be addressed as part of looking at T8 in any event. So one must look at the policy package as a whole, and just because one factor isn't mentioned in one policy doesn't mean it's going to be irrelevant in its entirety when other policies cover it. The points on T5, I think, have been mainly covered in response to T1 in terms of putting back in references to existing documents that are going to be a holding position in advance of the local transport plan. I don't need to repeat those because, again, they don't go to soundness. On policy T6, there was a complaint about the deletion of the word facilities at the beginning of the policy, but if one reads on, it's been replaced by the words high-frequency public transport routes / facilities, so that the point doesn't really go anywhere. And in any event, insofar as other considerations were raised by Mr May, they're covered by other policies in the transport suite anyway. Under T8, I think it's a similar point that was raised. Let me just check the notes, bear with me, sir. Again, Mr May, again, appears to be looking for elements to be added into the policy which are effectively covered under other policies in any event. So under demand management, the applications that are considered under that policy would have to, in any event, be considered by reference to policy T1, which covers sustainable access and other factors which need to be taken into account when considering proposals. So again, we don't think you need to add in aspects to one specific policy when they're going to be covered by the broader suite of policies in any event. Under T9, finally, we don't accept that splitting that policy into two is necessary to achieve soundness, and the criteria in the policy are sufficiently broad to capture all relevant considerations that would be applied to freight centres. So again, we don't think there's anything that needs to change in the policy to address matters of soundness. Just check if Mr Ridge wants to add anything.
No, I think that covers everything from my perspective, unless you have any questions, sir.
No, I think I've got a pretty clear understanding of where you're both coming from. Mr May, did you want to come back on anything briefly?
Well, just very briefly, I'm getting rather inured to the Council's approach to reject every suggestion that is made from others, which is unfortunate because there are areas here where we could very rapidly reach agreement if we didn't adopt a confrontational approach. But I just ask you, sir, to consider whether if a local plan that referred to the use of bus priorities and urban traffic control to support public transport was sound, it now becomes sound to remove those references. And I'd also ask you, sir, just to consider, if we are trying to promote improved public transport access and improved walking and cycling routes, but in the absence of a sustainable transport and development SPD, we have no basis for protecting them, whether that is sound. We are suggesting a way of providing interim protection, which is at the moment, as we see it, totally ignored. But I really don't want to pursue this. I think you will have a clear understanding of what we would like to see, and it's consistent with the policy that we developed earlier in the year, which you have in the documents we've submitted, and which we worked on in good faith with the Council to help them produce a local transport plan. So there's nothing in here that is incompatible with those recommendations.
I mean, clearly, as has been alluded to, the test for myself and Mr. Barclay, my colleague, is to look at these policies and the accompanying text and apply ourselves to the tests of soundness. I think we're going to have to do that. We're clearly going to have to. He and I are going to have to discuss what's been discussed here today. But that's our primary point. I think all local plans, in my experience, you could improve them, or always. They could be, they could provide more detail on certain aspects. I think that's always the case. But I think as inspectors, one has to be very careful to differentiate between improving a plan and asking yourself whether it's sound. Because after all, it's not for us to write the plan, it's the Council's plan. So it's the test of soundness that we'll be applying ourselves to. But it may well be that the plan does need some of those references to make it sound, and if so, then we would act accordingly.
Thank you, sir. And just very briefly in response, it's particularly with that test of soundness that we've put forward those comments. And of course, the two of you must judge whether what we're arguing makes the plan more sound or the absence of it makes the plan unsound. But I fully accept that's your prerogative.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, did you have an associated point? Go on, then.
Thank you. Can I just make a suggestion of something that might help you when you come to make those awkward judgments? Certainly my understanding of the government's wish through local plans is that the local plans should give certainty, or as much certainty as they can achieve for potential applicants and developers. And I'd certainly suggest that in regard to the transport section, having two generalised policies, which is the direction that the Council is going, actually makes it very difficult for applicants to actually understand what they will need to do, other than in a general sense. And that lay behind the submission that we've put in as an environment forum, which was put together with the assistance of Professor May, both in our original and in our subsequent written submissions. So I would commend that aspect of trying to have reasonably clear policies. What is a high-frequency public transport service? What land allocations do I need to make for cycle routes and so on? All those things are quite important. And the local plan, which is the land use plan, particularly needs to be clear on what the physical requirements are for the transport measures, which is why we'd like to see reasonable coverage in the local plan policies. The other point I'd make in relation to the soundness issue is, I think through the previous phases we've hopefully demonstrated, and in the evidence earlier that Professor May put forward, I think we've demonstrated the scale of the mismatch between the Council's transport ambitions, its climate change ambitions, and what's actually coming out of the analyses that the Council has done to provide for the evidence base for this plan. And that means that you actually need a very strong set of transport policies if you are going to go anywhere near trying to achieve those ambitions. And that is why it is important that the policies aren't weakened, as has happened in these latest set of modifications, were actually strengthened substantially. So, and I think that is an issue of soundness, because if the Council is to meet the climate change targets and ambitions that the government and the local council have, if it is to meet its own stated objective in the local plan of not increasing congestion, then if it does not have strong, really robust transport policies to apply to new developments, it will fail. The plan will not be sound without that.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. It is always a tricky balance between putting things, being specific matters in a plan, and yet giving the council enough flexibility to react to things that might change, so the plan doesn't put itself out of date because there's too much detail. One does have to look at that with some care, but I take your point, Mr.
Yes,
Lyons.
so that was precisely the point I was going to raise. We entirely take the point about there being a degree of predictability required when you're applying the policies, and we've fully borne that in mind. But the point raised by Mr. Merritt works both ways, that if one's too prescriptive about how a policy is applied, with no flexibility whatsoever, and one is overly prescriptive about how a policy applies, it removes a degree of flexibility in catching situations and ending up in arguments about whether a policy is caught in particular circumstances or not. So there is a balance to strike, and we say we have struck it appropriately in the circumstances of this case. There will inevitably be some policies where it's a degree of judgment has to be taken about their application, and we don't think we're following the wrong side of the line at all when one looks at the policies fairly in that respect. Just to pick on a couple of other points, I'd hope you'd realise by now we're not taking a confrontation approach about the plan. As with other policies, if we think there is genuine merit in a main modification, we will accept it and propose it. Bearing that in mind, though, we do think we have robust policies that are now before you, and we don't accept the criticism that's been advanced by Mr. Mayor or Mr. Merritt in that respect.
Thank you, Mr. Lyons. I think these matters will have to be left in our hands, Mr. Barclay, in my hands, and clearly, if we think further changes are required, then we will intervene. On the other hand, if we don't, then we can accept the modifications as they're put forward. But I think, yeah, I have the point, so that'll have to be left with us. Can we move on? Ms. Hilton, Mr. Corsia, you've got your nameplates up. Ms. Hilton, yeah,
Thank
please.
you. I'm wanting to pick up on T5, please. Mr. Ridge, just shortly before lunch, mentioned the new government standards for local transport notes, and I was hoping that you might say that they required cycle pedestrian routes to be segregated from traffic, but as he said that ST15 cycle routes would not be affected by the new LTN, although is it from 2020 actually? Is it LTN 120 you're talking about, or is there one that supersedes that?
No, it's LTN 120, which is it's a guidance on design standards and engineering. So actually, it's not sufficiently prescriptive that it would say routes have to be segregated, but there are obviously different standards which would be applied to a low traffic road which was used a lot by cyclists and pedestrians, to a segregated path, to something which is purely for cyclists. So, it's quite a broad document, but it has changed the way that we design facilities for not so much for pedestrians, but particularly for cyclists. And that's why we are revising our local cycling and walking infrastructure plan to take account of that, because schemes which were previously feasible have become, have changed their nature. Some have become unfeasible, some have become much more expensive to deliver, and we have to consider that.
Thank you. But nevertheless, it does include the section on quiet roads and being able to mix different modes of transport on a quiet road. And obviously, we would prefer that cycle routes were segregated from traffic, even on those quiet roads, for the reasons that we explained in Matter 7. I don't know if safety comes into soundness, but it certainly is unsafe to have a large number of cyclists mixing with a lot of heavy, not a lot, but occasional heavy traffic. And then adding pedestrians and horses into the mix is clearly unsafe. And I think I did read somewhere, was it in LTN 120, in fact, that there should be a trial period with consultation about this afterwards. Well, we kind of had an unofficial trial during the lockdowns, and it did turn out to be unsafe, as we predicted. Luckily, nobody was hurt. But we're talking about increasing the number of users by around about 100%. If we take the population of Fulford, Heslington, and the existing campus resident students, that's around about 9,500. If we add in, say, a population for ST15 of 8,000 people, conservative, plus the population of Elvington, plus the population of Weldrake, that also adds up to about 9,500 people. So we're talking about proportionately probably double the number of people, and almost certainly far more than that, because A, we're promoting active travel, great, but B, there's actually somewhere for them to go in the sense of having a journey from A to B, whereas at the moment those lanes go absolutely nowhere. So we're talking about a hugely increased number of users on a system which we feel is not suitable and unsafe. And I don't understand why, in a plan that is going to be in place for so many years, A, that you've not gone all out for segregated routes. I mean, the cost, even the cost of putting in the cycle route, according to Sustrans, is around £4 million, plus 40,000 maintenance annually. Well, compared to the cost of all the new road infrastructure you're talking about, the proportion of money needed to add a segregated link road onto the road infrastructure you're building is very small by comparison. So I don't understand why you're prepared to spend or have spent somebody's money, ours, I suppose, in the last analysis, on creating something which is less sound than it could be. So that would be my main point about that. And I was going to say something else, but it's escaped my mind at the moment, so I might have to come back.
I think, the other thing I would say when looking at policies of this sort and ideas, what we've discussed previously about how prescriptive you go, one does have to be a little careful because, to my mind, and it's an open mind, if you're too prescriptive in a policy, you tie the council and the developer to, a certain number or natures of solutions to a problem like how do you deal with walking and cycling from a strategic site. Whereas if you keep the policy not so specific, a little more flexible, you allow those things to be worked out at the development control stage. I'm not saying there's a right and a wrong way, but there's a balancing act in there that you have to be very careful of, I think.
Yes, sir. And the only other point I was going to add is obviously this point's been made in respect of T5, which will apply to developments across the local authority area, so that point's reinforced given the broad nature of the policy.
And I think I would also just add that as one of the hats that I wear historically has been around road safety. You know, under no illusion from having to deal with incidents what that actually means. We take it very, very seriously.
Can I just come back very briefly? I appreciate that this is a local plan-wide policy. I fully appreciate that. But what I was trying to say is an example of something that could be a segregated route, and you should be working towards that, not setting something up already that is frankly going to be wrong. But the other point that I was going to make that I'd forgotten was about the detail. Because in SS 13, item 13, bullet point 13, it is very, very specific about the route of the cycleways from ST15 in towards Heslington and York. Whereas it could say, it could be much more less specific and say, we will provide cycle routes, but it actually names the lanes that the cycle routes are going to use. So surely that is an example of being far too detailed with no flexibility to book better routes elsewhere.
I mean, I think I'd accept that, but I mean, the nature of the site-specific policies is that they are more detailed. It does name lanes that will be used, but if an alternative was available that was better, more safe, more appropriate, we would look at that, and those are the kind of questions that we'll be considering a detailed application scheme as they roll forward.
I had the point, yeah. Thank you. Mr. Coursier, I'll come to you next.
Sorry, sir, could I just...
Sorry.
Just to pick up on that point that Miss Hilton was mentioning, and I know she says that it's very specific and picks up at criterion 13, but actually there's a couple of other criterion that actually look at the broader cycle and pedestrian linkage aspects. So actually it picks up through other criterion as well, the need to look at a broader, more holistic approach. So criterion 17, which talks about optimising pedestrian and cycle integration, connection and accessibility in and around the site. And 18, optimising synergies in terms of site servicing, including transport. So I think we've got the wider aspects as well as the more detailed aspects, and that detailed aspect is a detailed aspect that was felt necessary as part of this proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Waring. Mr. Coursier, then I'll come to you.
So, I think that discussion actually highlights the difficulties, the procedural difficulties I think we on this side are having on this matter. Nearly all these proposed modifications have come in with hearing statements. Indeed, on ST15, they came in with... first time I looked at it was at 10 o'clock the night before the hearing, when I realised that a statement of common ground had been put in. So that's not adequate time to deal with what are essentially major revisions to policy. And that applies equally to the transport policies. Parish councils like Fulford, like Heslington, we run on monthly cycles. There's been no opportunity to actually put these very important proposed modifications to members and to get comments. As getting something at 10 o'clock at night, before the hearing, sir, I've looked back at the wording for ST15. There are major matters I would have liked to have brought up at that hearing,
which I just didn't occur to me in the time available, sir. So I really want to flag that up there, sir, because if you were to go along with these proposed modifications in your report, one of the matters you have to decide is whether you're going to reopen hearings into these policies.
We do indeed, yes.
So, and that is the point, sir, that I'm trying to raise, because I don't think there has been fair opportunity for people to raise matters relating to these. It just have come in too late. They should have been advertised and put through the normal consultation procedure. So, sir, with that, having said that, I've only got one point, sir, and that's on policy T2 I want to raise today. And I have to say, this is a personal opinion of mine rather than representing the parish council, because obviously I haven't had an opportunity to get any feedback on it. And that is, if you've got it, T2 in front of you. That is on the second bullet point in the second paragraph, where it refers to...
I didn't catch that. My mistake, Mr. Kersey.
Mr. Lyons, I do that quite frequently. It says policy T2.
T2.
Second paragraph, second bullet point. So when it's referring to expansion and improvements of park and ride network. So I'm not taking any further than that.
Understood.
So the issue I have, and if you look at the preamble to that list, is the council will enable and, where appropriate, require development to contribute to. I understand the required development to contribute to. I am totally unclear what the word enable means in that context. And can I just say, what this policy seems to be doing is to give some policy presumption in favour of schemes yet unknown to expand the park and ride network. And so we say that fails the policy tests in the MPPF. You're giving basically a blank check to the council on this matter. And so can I just refer you to paragraph 154 of the MPF that says, only policies that provide a clear indication of how a decision maker should react to a development proposal should be included in the plan. So this fails that test. And more clearly, it fails the PPG tests for policies. And so I'm sure you've been directed this many times, but just for your note, of course, it's 12.002, 13.0729. The what, where, when and how questions, which the local plan should make clear what is intended to happen in the area of the life plan, where and when this will occur and how it will be delivered. So that just clearly, we just don't know. There are no proposals in the plan for expansion of park and ride facilities, yet there is a blank check to do so. And so I don't even understand what the word, how the council will enable development, well, I'm not even quite certain what the word enable means there. And so what particularly concerns me for the designer outlet park and ride, so I'll give you an instance. The developer, the owner, is preparing to relocate the park and ride facility there onto land outside the current area with permission onto green belt land, and this policy would seem to enable that to happen as part of an expansion. So, and I think that's we think it fails the policy and guidance test, sir. And if the council, we don't have any problem with park and ride as a solution in York, but if there were to be policies to expand it, they should be shown by site allocations, sir. There should not be just a general presumption in favour of that.
Thank you, Mr. Kersey. Are you able to help on that, Mr. Linus?
Well, sir, just dealing with the first point on procedure. I'm not going to go over that again because although I wasn't there, I understand any complaint was dealt with at the sessions on ST15. I'm not going to go over old ground again. As for policy T2, I suspect the word enable is there to partly at least reflect the fact that it would be other parties, not the council, that's actually delivering these matters, but I don't think anything substantial turns on the use of the word enable. If there is a problem, a change could be made to reflect support or a word to that effect. The substance of the point appears to be the second bullet point relating to park and ride network. It's correct, there aren't any specific allocations in the plan, as I understand it. It's been set there as a development management point, and the simple response to Mr. Kersey is that any proposal for a park and ride would have to be read subject to other policies in the plan. And one can go through every single policy and say the determination of applications according to this policy will be subject to the consideration of other policies in the plan, but you're repeating that for every policy. One can take it that any proposal that does come forward would have to be determined in accordance with policies generally across the plan as a whole.
So the purpose, if the plan wishes to support expansion of park and ride, sir, it then has to answer the questions in the guidance, sir, of what and particularly where. We can't have a general support for something which we don't know the implications of. And so that I can't really take that point any further. I must leave that one to you.
I'm not reading the plan as proposing any expansion of park and ride.
As I said, so we're not allocating park and ride sites. The approach that's being taken is to leave it to the development management process. So nothing has been formally proposed, and any proposals that do come forward will have to meet the policies in the plan generally, including those relating to the green belt that Mr. Kersey has mentioned. So we don't think this is really a matter which goes to soundness, and the council isn't taking the approach in this plan of specifically proposing new park and ride facilities, but we'll deal with those matters as and when they arise in development management terms.
So I'm troubled by that response because obviously normally it's the council that promotes park and ride. So one would think that if they have specific proposals for expansion of park and ride, that would be, it's a major form of development, sir. It should be in the plan, to be perfectly frank. This isn't, if the council wishes to have further expanding the network, sir, in the plan period, then that should be in the plan, and that's what the PPG says. These are major developments, just in the same way housing and employment development is.
I wouldn't disagree with you. What I'm taking is that because there isn't any such expansion in the plan, then nothing specific is proposed. That's the way I'm reading it.
So in which case one wonders why the second bullet point is there in the first place.
The simple point is, as the policy wording indicates, at the very least by the words where appropriate require development contribute to, it's a recognition that through the lifetime of the plan there may be proposals which come forward and it may become necessary to contribute towards it. It's anticipating the possibility of needing to consider park and ride facilities, but it's not proposing one specifically at the moment, and that's not a particularly unusual situation.
I understand. Ms. Worthington.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm coming back to T1. I was pointed at the infrastructure delivery plan this morning for figures to support the suggestion of the policy in T1 that there was 10 years or 5 years. And I was also led to believe there was some leeway in that policy because of the way it's written about 10 years and 5 years. My understanding is that that's in relation to the strategic sites, we are looking for, the policy suggests that we're looking for funding for a period of up to 10, it actually says for a period of up 10 years. Is it a period of 10 years or a period of up to?
I think we can take that point, sir.
Yes, there's a bit of leeway there because of the wording, but if we're looking for a strategic, good, sustainable service that encourages development, surely we're looking for something that either does 10 years or 5 years after last occupation as the minimum. And on the strategic sites, that will mean of a period of 10 years, and they will carry on building after that 10 years with no support. And I completely understand that, that's reasonable. Doing less than 10 years wouldn't be, a developer could come along and say, right, I'm going to do it for 1 year. And so that wouldn't provide you with the clarity that you know that you've got a bus service coming for that period of time. I also looked to the figures that I was aimed at this morning, whereas primary school and secondary school, it's very clear how the figures are derived for the contributions. We're given specific figures of how much it costs to provide a primary school place or a secondary school place. No such figures are available for the bus services. And I understand that the figure we were given this morning of 150,000 to 200,000 was for not the provision of a service which would be suitable for the whole development. It's the provision of a single bus. I completely understand that that doesn't take any account of the number of people and how many fares that might generate. However, it's a completely unsupported figure, and it's not the provision of a bus service for the whole development, it's the provision of a single bus. And that's a hearsay figure that we haven't got any supported evidence of. At the moment, policy T1, as it's written, you can't tie it up with the evidence submitted on either ST14 or ST15 in terms of the amount of money required to support that bus service. And so, as currently written, the plan is not sound or justified.
Go ahead.
Thanks, sir. I mean, largely this is a repetition of what was being said before, because again, it's confusing what we're dealing with now, which is the wording of the policy with points that may have been raised before on the IDP in previous sessions, and Mr. Relvin's dealt with that already. Second thing I want to say, it's not entirely clear what Ms. Worthington is looking for in terms of the policy. It appears to be suggested that there ought to be flexibility in the policy, because one is dealing with something which covers a range of development. The intention behind it is I do take the point on the up 10 years. I think everyone's read that naturally as up to 10 years, but the point is, as we said earlier, that provides for a degree of flexibility which will be applied in the circumstances of each case. And if proposals are unacceptable applying that policy, they would be refused. There's nothing there which introduces any inconsistency between the policy and anything in an IDP, which makes the policy incapable of being applied properly to any individual proposal. So we don't think there's really a point here, and we're not entirely sure in any event what specifically Ms. Worthington's asking to do by way of the redrafting of the policy to achieve her aspirations.
Yeah, perhaps you could help with that.
I'm just pointing out that the plan is completely inconsistent in terms of its proposals in relation to the strategic sites and policy TP1. If you're thinking the site should only provide for a year. That's what you're now saying, up to 10 years. Well, a year is good enough. A year is up to one of the up to 10 years. We could say it's only a year. Perhaps it should be 6 months that we need to provide for. So perhaps the sites don't need to provide for £1 million or £500,000 or, you know, we need to know how much it costs to run a bus service and how many buses we would need to serve a site, and therefore how much money that generates and costs. And if we can't say that part of the policy accords with the amount of money that the council have agreed is acceptable, the council are contradicting their own policy in the quantities of money they have accepted as suitable for according with the policy.
I don't think that actually answers the question, but you have our point, sir.
What I'm taking the council's position to be is that if a developer on one of those strategic sites came forward with a proposal that included a bus service for 1 year, you would say, the council would say, sorry, it's not long enough. It needs to be X years, 10 years.
There's nothing in the policy which precludes that decision being taken. That's the whole point. There's some flexibility in the policy.
I think what I'm hearing from Ms. Worthington is that the developer would like some certainty at this stage of what the council is going to require in that sense. But can you help with that, or is that something that really does need to be considered at the time an application comes in?
Well, obviously matters will have to be considered at the time an application comes in, but one has the evidence that's been produced at the examination on the IDP and viability, which sets out for the purposes of plan making where we are on these strategic sites. And if it's being suggested that there should be some sort of schedule which specifically translates fixed figures for every single site, again, I think it gets back to the point that was raised earlier, sir. One's being highly specific in terms of each individual site at this stage, which isn't justified, particularly when these matters will inevitably have to be addressed at planning application stage.
We're back to that debate.
Yes, I think there's a temptation to look for matters in the policy which will naturally fall out within the compass of a policy at planning application stage.
I just think this policy doesn't give you the certainty, because it says, if we read it right, it's up to 10 years. Well, 1 year falls within that guidance. And if you went to appeal, you could argue that 1 year satisfies that requirement. It doesn't say 10 years. If it said 10 years and there was some indication of what a high frequency bus service, we don't even know whether that means 2 buses an hour, 4 buses an hour, 6 buses an hour. There are so many things that we don't know, because we don't know what the council are considering is suitable. And we don't know how the figures that are in the viability, which I don't think should be in this, but presumably they have been, they must have taken this into consideration, or perhaps they didn't. We don't know, because there's absolutely no justification whatsoever in terms of figures, how they've come up with £1 million, how they've come up with £2 million, how they came up with, £3.9 million on the really sustainable site in the urban centre, which is, would be actually much easier to get sustainable transport sorted for. Why did that one require such a high level of contribution, and yet the sites that are further out don't require such a high level of contribution? That suggests that this policy hasn't been applied, and in its current, the way it's written, there's no certainty that means that developers know exactly what they're going to have to do, because it says, even if you accept it, says up to 10 years, what does up to 10 years mean? It doesn't mean 10 years. It means, you know.
So, sorry, just to respond very briefly. I mean, I think I don't need to go over what I've said already, but again, it gets back to this issue about the plan not needing to be as prescriptive and as ossified as that, particularly when these matters will be considered at a planning application stage. And quite apart from policy T1, if one looks at some of the strategic site policies, there'll still be a requirement for necessary transport infrastructure to be delivered. So if there's a debate about that at planning application stage, that would become a matter of evidence in the circumstances of any individual case. So again, we repeat the point that we don't think it's right or necessary for soundness for policy to be as prescriptive as Worthington appears to suggest. And we don't consider that the drafting of the policy in any way limits us to finding proposals that we regard as unacceptable in transport terms as being acceptable because of the way the policy is drafted.
I'm flicking through the plan as submitted and the mods that you would have to read T1 alongside the strategic allocation.
If one takes the ST15 allocation, there's a requirement there to ensure provision of necessary transport infrastructure to access the site. One can go through other examples, and obviously those criteria would have to be applied when an application comes in. It's not necessary to go further and specify what the level of bus service is going to be, what the cost of any particular access is going to be, because it's too prescriptive for the purpose of a plan policy.
Can you help with the up to 10 years, though? Can that be made a little more specific?
I think the difficulty is, so obviously this is a policy that applies across the board to every single development proposal, and once you start moving away from that to put in something more detailed, it's difficult for me to say at this stage that there'd be a neat point at which you would stop. Yeah. You know, I don't want to assume any particular form or level of, or even timing of provision carried across any number of development sites, which is why I think the wording was deliberately put in as flexible as that.
Is it fair to say, and I'm doing this in a spirit of helpfulness, though, rather than, well, I'm just trying to iron out this discussion. In a strategic housing site, if a bus service proposal came forward, it would be looked at against the up to 10 years provision, but the likelihood is it would be more often than not 10 years rather than 2 years. I can't see how 1 year would work.
No, I mean, the intention of saying up to 10 years is to provide the developers with some certainty about what an upper limit would look like, and an assurance that they wouldn't be supporting a bus service in perpetuity. And that's been, you know, importantly, it's been used in the viability testing on the strategic sites. I mean, relating to the actual numbers in the IDP, and I think accepting maybe that the numbers in the IDP are a different thing from the soundness of policy T2. They're actually, I think I've already said this, but I'm a public transport economist by background. These are things that are quite difficult to calculate because you don't know the amount of revenue that you will earn on these services. But my experience with delivering similar services elsewhere in the country is that £1 million is an appropriate sum for developing a service of that sort for that site. There was a specific suggestion as well that high frequency doesn't mean anything. Actually, that's not true. High frequency is defined by the Department for Transport as a service of at least every 15 minutes or better. And we would adopt that definition.
if let's say I'm a developer and I'm looking to develop one of these strategic sites and I'm looking at what I'm going to do in terms of bus services, my approach ought to be, it seems, to assume that I'm going to be funding a bus service for 10 years. And then if it turns out that it's less, well, fine, but my assumption, worst case scenario, 10 years.
Yes, and obviously what we would like to happen, and we will work very hard with developers to ensure this, is that services become commercial as quickly as they possibly can. We've got some experience in that for various developments that we've already seen delivered in York. In fact, because of the park and ride network, we've probably got more experience about setting up new bus services than pretty much any other council in the country. So yes, I mean, that would be the way it would normally follow. There's also, and I don't know to what extent this is even relevant to the local plan, but there is a procedural, the procedure that we would normally go through as a Transport and Planning Authority for a new bus service, is that we would look for, the developer would probably come up with proposals for the bus service as part of their planning application, but in terms of actually procuring that bus service, they would probably pay us a sum of money and we would procure it ourselves, in which case there is obviously a very strong control over the quality of that service and how long it runs, because we would, we'd be looking for the contribution and then we would procure it ourselves and manage and organise it.
Helpful, thank you. Does that assist?
It does to some extent, but we've heard that strategic sites would pay for 10 years. I mean, they're going to develop over 20, some of them 15, 20 years, 10 years. Well, why does it say up to in the policy then?
Well, I'm thinking it's because there will be some situations where it doesn't need to be 10 years.
But we've got the 5 years after last completion anyway. So if it's a smaller site that only needs, perhaps 6 years of bus support because it's all developed in the first year, that's covered by that. But why have we got up to 10 years for the major strategic sites? It just doesn't give that degree of certainty. And we, as I say, we have no justification for the levels of funding that have been required presumably under this policy for the strategic sites. I completely understand the expertise sitting on the opposite side of the table. However, where's the justification? There is absolutely none in any of the information submitted by the council.
But if I may, I think the figures, the numbers, as I'm understanding it, are in the IDP. I'm examining, or my colleague and I are examining the plan.
But the supporting evidence in the plan, and we haven't got anything other than this site is going to contribute this amount of money and, we're going to do a bus service.
I think that would be a problem if the plan and the policies in the plan were setting out the numbers, but my reading is that they don't do that. So that what the figures would eventually be would be a matter for negotiation at application stage. What the plan's doing is making sure that there's the facility for that conversation to take place, if I'm reading it correctly.
Yes, it's precisely so, sir.
No, because if you have that, if you say we'll ignore everything that went previously and we'll have this agreement, we'll have a discussion subject, to look at this policy. It says, we've got to do it up to 10 years. Well, we don't fancy doing it for 10 years and the site's not terribly viable, so we will only do it for 5. It's one of those things. The policy doesn't give enough certainty to anyone to know how long they are expected to give that requirement for good public transport, which is absolutely essential to create a sustainable city.
I understand, but I don't think we need to dwell on this any further.
So I think you have our points about it being a long stop and the reality that this will be negotiated on a case-by-case basis at application stage.
I'm hoping that we're getting towards the end of the discussion on the first couple of questions and we can move on to air quality soon. But Mr. Merritt, was there something you wanted to add?
Just 2 points on the exchanges that have just been going on. Just going back to when I was on the council and had involvement on planning and transport, my recollection was even with the policies we had in those days, it was incredibly difficult negotiating the bus provisions out of developers. I can quote one example, the Terry's factory site. Enormous arguments went over there, major redevelopment of the office, the factory itself, but also the grounds for a large amount of new housing, and originally for quite a lot of employment as well. And there were all sorts of promises and commitments made in terms of new bus provision, increased bus provision. And actually, at the end of the development, none of it happened. Nothing. We were still stuck with the same service that now doesn't even run on a Sunday past it. So, you do have to have robust policies with clear expectations. And just in terms of the figures, in terms of what it costs to run a bus service, just looking at the council's 29